TV's kind of loud. I'll have to turn it down. Be right back. Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, quick question. Is anything real? No, seriously, it's just a real question. I promise this isn't an introduction for a Matrix comic book or anything like that. But if we look at sort of today's society and the conversations that are taking place more and more in our day-to-day reality, an important question really needs to be asked, which is, what is real and what is fake? And I know immediately people are going to be prompted by this, but I have to say it. What is news? What is fake news? What is information? What is fake information? And again, what is real and what is not real? I'm not sure I have a good answer for this, because there are literally people who have spent their entire lives writing book after paper, just asking the same question over and over again, and ultimately not really coming up to any satisfying conclusions. Now, I am an empiricist, so ultimately I fall upon the idea of what can be proved, or what is real is ultimately what can be proved. Again, I know, for instance, that bears exist. I know because I've seen them in my local zoo. I love bears. I've seen artistic representations of them. I've seen photographs of them, and I've seen book after book after book about bears. So, empirically speaking, we have proof for the existence of bears. There is no empirical evidence for the existence of unicorns, apart from an artistic representation of them. And sometimes trick of the eyes when certain horses, or honestly sometimes wild antelopes, will sort of turn their head and their horns sort of merge into one single visual symbol. Or rhinos. But unicorns aren't real, or at least the traditional image of unicorn isn't real. What is real? Unicorns aren't real, for the record. I'm not saying that they're real. Okay, anybody who thinks a unicorn actually exists, just go away. This is all kind of just like a long, convoluted way of introducing the book that I'm going to talk about today, which is Sabrina by Nick Dernasso. And this... It's too bad she's not going to live. But then again, who does? That was weird. Anyway, Sabrina came out in the year 2018, and the book has actually got a lot of popular appeal behind it, and actually a lot of critical appeal as well. So much so, it is the first graphic novel nominated for the Booker Prize. Now, the Booker Prize, or the Man Booker Prize, is a yearly literary award that is nominated for books and authors who are citizens of what's collectively known as the Commonwealth. Now, if you live in England, you probably know what the Commonwealth is. And if you live here in America, no, the Commonwealth is not the Commonwealth from Fallout 4, ad Victoriam. Anyway, the Commonwealth is Canada, Australia, India, countries that used to be part of the British Empire. Well, Sabrina has been nominated for this award, and honestly, rightfully so. This is an amazing book. It crossed my path when I was at the library. Again, I tend to be the comics guy, so I'm always looking through the comics section up in resource services. I'm always reshelving in graphic novels and comics, and whenever I'm looking through book returns, I always check to see what comics have made their way back through. Naturally, Sabrina came down the pike, and it honestly didn't really seem like that important a book. Like, I opened it up, and looking at just the artwork, you really wouldn't think that this book was really that important or that interesting or that relevant. As you can see, the artwork is very iconic. And if you remember from a previous video, iconic is not in the sense of iconic, symbolic, what have you. It's iconic in the idea of it's very more basic. Again, if we look at faces, you have very little detail. Maybe some hair, eyes are just 2 dots at that, and a couple of lines to indicate a nose and a mouth. And then body design, a lot of these characters tend to remind me of Lego figurines more than they do actual human beings. Nonetheless, there's a lot of deceptive simplicity in the artwork of Sabrina, and it's one that really I didn't see coming. The book itself is a story about a woman by the name of Sabrina who is murdered, but technically not. The book actually follows several individuals, most notably the main protagonist, character I showed you a second ago. His name is Calvin, and he works for the Air Force, and he primarily does a lot of intel work, which usually involves him on a computer reading lots of conspiracy theorist web pages and figuring out potential threats. Now, that might have seemed like science fiction 10, 20, 30 years ago, but we're all now living in a post-Edward Snowden age. Hello, FBI agent, whoever you are. I hope you're having a lovely day and enjoying these videos. Moving on. The fact of the matter is, Calvin's job is pressingly relevant, and it also gets into the heart of what will eventually become the meat of this book, because he has an old friend named Teddy, whose girlfriend Sabrina disappears. For a month, in fact. And so Teddy, being emotionally distraught, comes to live with Calvin. And then during this time together, a videotape circulates which shows Sabrina being murdered. The scene in question, if I can find it, I always mark way too many pages. Here we are. I'm going to go ahead and do what I always do. Go ahead and pause your screen and read. Pause your screen and read. 2 more, I promise. Pause your screen and read. Pause your screen and read. Okay. Looking at those, even if you didn't actually pause your screen and read, you've got some attitude, mister. You probably are able to observe that in terms of physical action, there's not really a lot going on in this book. Yet this scene here is arguably, in terms of plot, in terms of narrative, one of the most crucial moments. Because at this moment, you have 2 men who are working for a paper. Excuse me, one of them's a woman. My apologies, I assume their gender. Bad jammer. You have a man and a woman working for a local paper who receive a cassette tape in the mail. Now, you don't know what a cassette tape is because you're 14 and you've found my videos by accident. Back in my day, we had these things called VCRs. You would put the tape into them, and of course, whoever had it last didn't rewind it. A cassette tape arrives in the mail. I don't know what the heck that was. I shouldn't try to be funny. And on the videotape is a young man by the name of Timothy murdering Sabrina. This blows up, and the remainder of the book is largely a cultural examination fixated on the characters of Teddy and Calvin as they become the very center of a mass conspiracy theory about Sabrina. And I'll provide a couple more passages here right as I get back. All right, now I had a couple style... What was I saying? Oh, before I actually got back into the content of the real meat of what Sabrina is about, I wanted to talk a little bit about design further. Because again, consistently, even at its most dramatic, Sabrina is really unique in terms of comic studies for the way Nick Dornasso plays with panels. Again, you will sometimes have larger frames, but for the most part, most frames don't get much larger than this, and most dialogue options tend to be short and sweet. Now, at first, this may seem a very sort of simplistic model, but again, I think that yields to an interesting complexity, because if you consider most day-to-day interactions, they're not terribly grandiose. Most of the time, you don't say a lot to people during the day, or at least I don't tend to say a lot to people during the day. Hey, how's you doing? How you doing? Doing well? Doing well. Good. Good. See you later. See you later. Interactions tend to be pretty brief in our day-to-day lives, not because we aren't interested in other people in their lives, but just because certain realities take hold. I gotta get to work on time. I've got to start doing my work. My work requires me to just be in front of my computer, either entering in data, doing what have you. So one of the things I really like about this book is that at first a lot of the mundane qualities seem to be either, how you say, I had an original thought and now it's disappeared. In terms of design, Sabrina is an interesting book because continually there seems to be a deceptive simplicity. A lot of the meat happens to be in what is the words. But if you really look at it, I really feel that this design structure is trying to say a lot about the way people have a tendency to live their lives right now. Again, most of our interactions are taking place online, and so most of the interactions between people in real life are very small, whereas the regular survey sheet somehow manages to have more emotional impact upon the viewer than interactions between other characters. Now, this is where you get into interesting ideas of like modernism and postmodernism, alienation of the individual from society, but that's way too much for what I really want to do here with this book, which is try to understand why I think Sabrina is so important. But at the same time, that might tie into it. So, for example, there's this passage here where Teddy has moved into Calvin's place, and he and Calvin decide to sit down and watch TV, and Calvin pops up wearing a Snuggie. Yeah, do you remember those infomercials from like 1 in the morning of the weird family wearing the Snuggie at the soccer game? What, I'm the only one who remembers that infomercial? It's a reference in Big Bang Theory. Oh god, I remember a reference in Big Bang Theory. Anyway, this small passage here, oh yeah, feel free to pause and read it if you want, but honestly, really, I really want you to see at this moment, we really just have two people having a kind of awkward conversation. Teddy is continually throughout this book depressed. He doesn't really say all that much, or if he is, he's usually in a state of crying, or he's listening to conspiracy theory radio programs and experiencing the trauma of the fact of, one, he's losing his girlfriend, and then two, he's having to deal with the murder of his girlfriend, and then three, watching people begin to sort of create these conspiracy theories in which the whole thing was fake. Again, tying into this notion of fake news. Before I get to that, I really want you to observe what's interesting about Sabrina is the design of the comic. These are small, simple repeating panels over and over and over again. So at first, it doesn't really seem like there's a lot of play in this book, but sometimes the repetition and the simplicity yields to a really interesting complexity. I got up because I really also wanted to bring attention to this book here, The Adventures of Jimmy Corrigan, the Smartest Kid on Earth. Now, the reason I hold this book so many different ways is this is a book by Chris Ware, and Chris Ware is a cartoonist whose work has appeared in and on the covers of the New Yorker magazine, as well as numerous other periodicals, and his work is noted for being extraordinarily experimental, but also at the same time extraordinarily simplistic. If you've ever seen a Chris Ware, sometimes it can be really simple, but then also sometimes really complex. Again, when we look at iconic artwork, we have to remember that simplicity is kind of deceptive. That simplicity allows you to begin to impart yourself onto these characters, and that's important, because then to move into the content of the work, I said again, Calvin's job is to assess deep fakes, or fake news. And so what eventually begins to happen is that as the events of Sabrina's murder begin to dominate a lot of people's attention, there began to be more and more conspiracy theories about the fact that people begin to think it's a deep fake, or that Calvin and Teddy are what's known as crisis actors. Now, if you don't know what either of those are, deep fakes are forged videos that are basically fake. It would be like if somebody took this video here and then implanted me saying horrible, despicable, racist things, but using a slightly altered voice. Deepfakes are actually becoming more and more common on the internet, and a lot of intelligence agencies are getting worried about them. Now, also the term crisis actors. Now, this is a really, really unfortunate term, and I really, really hate that I have to explain it, because explaining it feels like I'm providing some manner of justification for it. But the way it works as a crisis actor is somebody who's supposedly a paid actor who's pretending to be the victim of a traumatic event. This is a term that's become really prolific in the culture right now, especially in the wake of a lot of school shootings. It's almost the day after that people are already beginning to say that students imagine this, or that they're crisis actors, that this isn't a real event. This is a problem, because again, it's getting back into that issue of what is real, what is not real. How do I know that what I'm looking at is real? So looking at the content of the book, again, Teddy listens to a lot of conspiracy theorists, and then Calvin spends a lot of his time reading online articles by conspiracy theorists. And so as the book progresses, what's fascinating is him observing his own sort of emotional breakdown in terms of being just interrupted constantly in terms of his life, but then also finding himself at the center of all these conspiracies, which are already part of his job. One of the fundamental core themes of this book is the way that conspiracy can sometimes wear our spirits down and alienate us from our own emotional states. Because if I can begin to think that the events that I haven't experienced aren't real, why am I investing emotion into them? Or should I invest emotion into them? This is a conflict, and it's something that we as a society are dealing with right now. Because as soon as anybody shares a meme on Facebook, you immediately have to go, is this fake? As soon as somebody shares an article online, is this fake? As soon as we see a speech by the president or a former president, is this fake? So this is a reality that we're experiencing more and more and more, and Sabrina does a really good job of exploring the human toll of so much conspiracy and the way people can become so swept up in the desire for something that seems real to not be real, and for something that is clearly not real to be real. There's a lasting relevance to Sabrina, and so in this way, I would argue, got to use a fancy pants word here, it captures the zeitgeist in a way very few comics have in recent memory. Now, there's a couple more quotes I want to talk about before I sort of come to my final so what statement about this, but I'll be right back. All right, now, oh, good Lord. What I was going to say is to tie into this theme of what is real and what is not. I'll just put this on for the time being. What is real and what is not is a really difficult question to ask, not simply because of the fact that we who are living right now are living in a culture where the conceptions of real versus fake is becoming a day-to-day struggle. We also have to consider the long-term effects of what this can have upon our psyche. Because one of my favorite graphic novels of all time, Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth by Grant Morrison and Dave McKean, is a really interesting exploration of insanity. It's kind of an okay Batman book, or at least I think it's an okay Batman book, but in terms of just a book about insanity and mind and myth and symbol period, this is an incredible book, and I've actually written a review of it for my friend's regular comic book or comic series, The Comics Classroom, and I'll post a link to that in the description section below. But looking at this book, what's really interesting is one of the final interactions of the book. Batman is talking to a psychiatrist who has just murdered somebody who was trying to kill Batman, and he asks for Harvey Dent's coin back. And he says, I have to go back. I have to prove to them that I'm stronger than them. And she says, that's insane. To which case he says, exactly. Arkham was right. Sometimes madness makes us what we are. Now, what does that have to do with Sabrina? Ultimately, one of the sort of closing effects of this book is that Teddy eventually manages to warp himself out of his depressive cycle and comes to grips with what actually happened. And as for, in terms of Calvin, he's able to push past it because he has desires to reconcile with his ex-wife and his daughter. So ultimately, he finds some manner of what is real. Looking at Sabrina as a book, one of the interesting things about it is that we don't necessarily escape from the trauma that we experience in our lives. One of the closing passages is after Calvin has left his job in the Air Force, he's driving down to Florida to be with his wife, and he has a nightmare about the man who killed Teddy's ex-girlfriend. The man basically experiences kind of like a nightmare vision about how he will never be free from it. And the truth is, he will never be free from it. If we consider the traumatic experiences that we've encountered in this life, we're never going to be the same people after them. Again, as always, I've mentioned it before, but I've gotten out of a really bad marriage recently, and I've been a victim of a lot of emotional abuse, not solely from my ex-wife, but then also from a lot of people in my life who have tried to control me and manipulate me. And I'm never going to be completely 100% okay. But I've moved past that experience. I've processed it, and day by day I'm growing. In the case of Sabrina, the question of, is this real, is this not real? Ultimately, it's not really answered to a really solid definitive state. The reader's really geared up to assume that, hey, yes, Sabrina's really dead. She really was murdered. This kid was just some weird psychopath who was just broken. But society, nonetheless, has forever been impacted by the brutality of the death. And so they are left permanently scarred by this death and have to find some narrative that justifies this random act of violence. And so they rely back upon conspiracy. So one of the interesting things about Sabrina in terms of its lasting relevance is the fact it's going to be a book that talks about the fact that we as a generation were severely and regularly impacted by trauma. It seems like every other week for a while there, a new video came out of some innocent civilian being killed, of someone being hurt, and we've had to reconcile this. Now, some of us do, some of us don't. It happens. But what's interesting to me about Sabrina is it uses a lot of iconic imagery and a lot of really effective comic structures in order to explore this idea of overcoming trauma, surviving through trauma, and ultimately finding some semblance of what is real. Now again, we each have to come down to our own assumption, or how you say, summation of what you believe is real. And you might come to different conclusions than I do. But the fact of the matter is, we do have to find, in the end, some answer to the original question of, well, is anything real? For my own part, I think it is. May not always be what I think it is, but it is. So, with that, I think I've said what I need to say. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it so much. As always, like, share, subscribe, all that jazz. Please leave comments in the comment section below if there's a book that you think is pretty cool and you want me to review it or talk about it, what have you. And as always, definitely check out Sabrina. It's a really, really important book, a really relevant book, and an amazing graphic novel. Your comic shop probably has a copy of it, and if they don't, they can probably order it for you. And if you don't have a local comic book shop, check out your local public library, because I guarantee you they'll probably have a copy, or they can get it to you through interlibrary loan. Thank you so much, as always, for watching. I really appreciate it. Go read some comics.